Hello everyone, my name is Ralph Moore. I'm a PhD candidate at Trinity College Dublin, and for this video essay for Trinity History Con 2020 I'd like to talk a little bit about the relationship between Creative Assembly's Total War series of video games and the historiography of imperialism in the ancient world. For those unfamiliar with it, the Total War series is a set of PC strategy games mixing turn-based and real-time elements from the developer Creative Assembly, released over the last 20 years. The majority of games in the series utilise historical settings, ranging from 16th century Japan to medieval Europe, the world of the 18th century and the Napoleonic Wars, with recent forays into mythological or even fantastical worlds. The two games focused on in this essay are Rome Total War, originally released in 2004, and its sequel Total War Rome 2, released in 2013, two of the most popular and enduring entries. Both are set in the period circa 275 BC to 15 AD, focusing on the world of the Mediterranean Sea, Middle East and parts of Europe, and allow players to take control of a state in the hope of forging a vast territorial empire with it. Though at times criticised for historical inaccuracies, especially regarding some of the creative choices in the first game, both pieces are undergirded by a respectable amount of genuine research and attention to detail, and provide the player with a good deal of accessible trivia, making them a potentially valuable tool for engagement with the history and archaeology of the period. Rather than nitpick the content of the games, however, this essay will focus on the more nuanced issues raised by how their framework of empire building as a game, and their capacity to explore alternate histories, relates to imperialism as a historical and cultural phenomenon. A quick disclaimer for any fans out there: I'm not here to attack the Total War series or suggest that it advances any kind of ideology, but, in the spirit of inquiry and critique, to ask questions about how we interact with the past through media consumption. So, the first thing I want to look at is how the games represent imperialism in terms of its motivation, particularly when it comes to Roman imperialism, because historically Rome was the civilization that actually founded an empire dominating the entire Mediterranean and the lands beyond it. What is it that prompts people to, form armies and then go and conquer the lands around them and form an empire in the sense that we would understand it? What we're going to do over the next couple of minutes is look at three major theories about what motivated the Roman Republic to turn to imperialism in this very militarily expansionistic approach, how they justified it, and then particularly how the Total War games focused on Rome represent this in terms of the mechanics that drive basically the desire to win in building an empire in the Mediterranean world. The first of these theories that we're going to look at is the idea of imperialism as grand strategy. In the history of the Roman Empire, this idea is primarily associated with a scholar named Edward N. Luttwak, someone who is primarily a US military strategist and an ancient historian a rather distant second. His work, starting in the 70s, focused on the idea of viewing the history of the development and survival of the Roman Empire through the lens of grand strategy, thinking about huge sweeping vistas of frontiers, battles, provinces, conquests across large territorial spheres in the movements of armies, and seeing it as part of a coordinated plan in order to protect the homeland and control the world around them. Luttwak's conclusions, repeated with increasing stubbornness in the second and third editions of his work coming out in later decades, saw this plan as a set of evolving goals for the Roman government, moving from initial control of the Italian peninsula to control of the wider lands of the Mediterranean, eventually reaching its apogee with control of all lands up to certain geographic frontiers that the Roman Empire used, most notably the Rhine, Danube and Euphrates rivers and the Sahara Desert in Africa, which mark the boundaries of the Roman Empire at its peak that we're used to seeing in modern maps, and in many ways create a bit of a framework for the game map in Rome Total War and Total War Rome 2. Luttwak's work has come under fairly comprehensive criticism from most other historians of the Roman Empire, mostly because his approach incorporates a lot of modern assumptions which are anachronistic for the period that he's looking at. Particularly in terms of the Roman Empire, in contrast to the kind of Cold War era grand strategy in which Luttwak actually cut his teeth as a strategist, Rome simply didn't have the same level of geographical foreknowledge in terms of being able to have a bird's eye view of the world that it was expanding into, or the kind of long-range rapid communication that would be needed to ensure that armies in certain areas of the world could be informed of things on the other side of the world, they could be moved around quickly. Essentially, it's taking a very 20th century view of how imperialism is supposed to work on the ground and in the strategy room, as we might think of it, and applying it to a very different, much more technologically primitive world. So the Total War Games approach to depicting ancient imperialism does smack of the grand strategy approach in two key ways, somewhat awkwardly. The first is to do with the mechanics of how you actually view and build your empire. You are, as the player, looking down at a very bird's eye view of the world in a way that no Roman general, commander, or anyone from the ancient world would have been able to do in the same way that you can. And while both games do employ a mechanic known as the fog of war, in which you can't actually see into lands beyond those which you control, and often you don't really know exactly what the terrain, where certain settlements and where armies will be until you actually start exploring them with your forces, you still have the advantage that you can see all of your territory at a glance, and you can issue orders to armies in one area and in another area instantaneously without having to face any of the logistical difficulties of communication that an actual general of the time would have had to face in real time. The other main issue is that in framing the game around giving players long-term objectives for their campaign in terms of winning by controlling X number of provinces, I believe it's normally 50 in Rome Total War 1, and then in some of the victory conditions for Rome Total War 2, many of them specify you need to control these specific areas of the map that are given by name. So even if the player is playing for the first time, doesn't know a lot about ancient history and geography, and doesn't necessarily know where these regions are on the map, they are given the information ahead of time that they can only win by controlling those areas, thus arguably giving a somewhat artificial shaping to their approach to building an empire as they go forward. This really highlights an interesting tension in the game's approach to the experience of history, in terms of whether they're attempting to be a kind of role-play simulation of what it would have been like to be a ruler in the ancient world, or whether they're really just an exercise in armchair generalship for people who are interested in military history for its own sake. So the second of the three theories of Roman imperialism we're dealing with here is one that's a little less unified than that of Luttwak, because it derives from a combination of different scholars' work, most importantly Benjamin Isaac and William Harris. Its major difference from the previous one is that whereas Luttwak's theory was very outward-looking in terms of looking away from Rome towards new territories to conquer, new frontiers to build, this one instead is much more inward-looking in terms of thinking of Rome as a centre of competition for power between different groups and factions therein. The Roman Republic was a society in which members of the ruling class were in constant competition with each other to demonstrate who was the better politician, who was the better general, and to match up to the very publicly demonstrated achievements of their predecessors and ancestors as well. This was something that was carried over to a certain extent with the regime change to the imperial monarchy, with emperors having to constantly prove that they were good enough to be considered the top person in Rome, rather than being able to take it for granted. Evidence of this culture of high-profile competition for honours and recognition comes both from the literature of the time period. We can see it in the writings of Cicero, in the writings of Caesar, who is very keen to mention in his accounts of his own military campaigns every time he did something worth getting public thanksgiving or praise from the Senate back in Rome. The Greek historian Polybius, writing in the 2nd century BCE, credited this culture of comparing themselves against their ancestors, of seeking praise from the public for their achievements, as being one of the key reasons that Rome was so successful in becoming a ruling power in the Mediterranean in comparison to its rivals in Carthage and the Greek world. We can also see it in the material record, especially as we move into the imperial period, with great monuments being set up to record and celebrate the achievements of successful generals. We have triumphal arches and things like Trajan's Column, which really emphasize this idea of a need for praise and celebration of achievements, mostly happening outside of Rome, but then seen in the theatre of Rome itself rather than further afield. The approach of Roman imperialism, particularly in terms of wars of conquest, being motivated by a desire of Roman leaders to gain more position and praise in Rome itself, comes through in the Total War games in a number of ways. It's particularly emphasised for the Romans in Rome Total War 1, in which Rome as a power is actually split into 3 different playable factions, with a 4th non-playable one representing the Senate, with players taking control of essentially what is supposed to be one of the major Roman ruling families, who are controversially treated as essentially governing parts of the Italian peninsula as personal fiefdoms, and then expanding out in one direction or another and gaining praise from the Senate and or people of Rome as a result of their conquests, with the idea that eventually the leader of that family that you're playing will be able to overturn the Republican regime and become emperor in their own right. In Rome, in Total War Rome 2, it's a little bit more nuanced, as an update implemented a politics system within each of the playable groups that splits them into smaller kind of internal factions vying for power, which in Rome represent different patrician families competing for different amounts of influence over Rome as a whole, and then different dynasties or approaches in other factions. This is where the game's approach can be a little bit criticised, both for being rather awkwardly and anachronistically implemented in the first one, and then in the second one taking something which is very characteristically Roman and attempting to apply it to other civilizations that might not necessarily have had the same approach to foreign conquest as a source of political capital. Theory number 3 that we're dealing with is one derived from the works of Arthur Eckstein, which is the notion of the ancient Mediterranean as a world of what he calls multipolar anarchy. This is a rather highfalutin term for the idea that this was the kind of wild, wild west. If the Wild West was, a sea surrounded by land rather than, a largely waterless landscape. You get the drift. Essentially, it's the idea that in the ancient world of these often not necessarily isolated, but often very independent, very warlike states, there was no real external guarantee of international relations, of holding up of treaties, other than the power which the individual parties held. So if you wanted to maintain a peace treaty, you had to ensure that there was an effective deterrent for either of the two parties, or even more, from breaking it and acting opportunistically. One of the main reasons for this case of events in the time period that we're dealing with, so starting from around 275 BCE up towards the rise of the Roman Empire afterwards, is that initially there's no one power in the Mediterranean world that can act as a hegemon or a guarantor, or even, two powers around which other forms of international relations might revolve in a kind of Cold War or rivalry scenario. So Eckstein sees this as a world in which Rome isn't necessarily any more warlike or expansionistic or imperialistic than any of the other states around it. It just happened to be, lucky or essentially talented at those things enough to be ultimately successful. If Rome hadn't done it, essentially someone else would. The motivation towards imperialism in this case is that if you don't become powerful by expanding your own territory, taking resources from it and controlling the areas around it, basically you will be too weak to fend off other people who will do the same to you and add your territory, your people, to their own empires. Now, Eckstein's work can be, and indeed has been, criticised for essentially taking Roman historians likely to propagandize and to post-rationalized, post-justify the creation of the imperial system in Rome at their word as to why it had to happen. Not only is this taking people who, are looking from a much later chronological horizon back at the achievements of their predecessors, but also taking people who are very much involved in propagandizing the Roman Empire as a good and necessary thing, very literally when they say why it had to happen. One of my own particular bugbears is that he takes what are very stereotypical, very rhetorically charged descriptions of certain non-Roman peoples as being dangerous, belligerent barbarians who, threatening the civilized world, had to be conquered in order to ensure that they didn't, destroy everything. Eckstein essentially takes this as being a fact of history rather than something that is a literary construct by people who were invested in the power that these stories had for themselves and for political purposes. The notion of multipolar anarchy as a push towards imperialism comes through in the Total War games in a number of ways. In a most basic one, you have AI factions that are programmed to threaten and expand against each other and you if you get in their way. And this varies to a certain extent from AI difficulty setting to difficulty setting, with higher ones being not only more aggressive but much more competent in their capability to threaten you, pushing the player to say, well, I definitely need to really get a start on building up my empire, gathering more resources, building larger and more effective armies, so that I won't be swallowed up by one of the AI challenges. It also, to a certain extent, comes through in diplomacy, perhaps a little bit stronger in the first game, which is rather notorious for alliances breaking down, for diplomacy being essentially useless between factions as opposed to the much more brute force of war and conquest. And even in the second one, playing with the ability to need to have strong, stable alliances maintained by powerful armies and deterrence between each other is in many ways a key part of gameplay. And so we come to part 2 of this video essay, which looks at the issues created by the game's approach of having roughly, though not always exactly, the same mechanics applied to differing cultures in their approach to imperialism across the ancient world. Strategy games, like the Total War series, require a standardized, coherent set of rules in order to function. Real-world history, sadly, is however nowhere near as neat. This can create very definite issues of historical accuracy when your playable options include such a diverse array of cultures. The imperialism as practiced by the Roman Republic was quite different from the imperialism as practiced by Carthage, or the Hellenistic successor states, or the Parthian Empire. This isn't even touching on what imperialism mostly a theoretical concept, would look like if practiced by Northern European tribal peoples or Eurasian steppe nomads. To examine this issue in greater detail, we are now going to go through 3 short case studies of playable options in Total War Rome 2, which represent cultures that were not historically known for their imperialism, but are given the option in the game world. Our first case study concerns the Iceni, or Iceni, if you want to be very proper with your Latin pronunciation. Historically, the Iceni are identified in Latin and Greek sources from the 1st and 2nd centuries AD as a people inhabiting what is now the East Anglia region of England. They have the distinction of probably being the best known of the various Iron Age British peoples in the modern imagination, which is likely the rationale behind their use as the kind of in-game representative playable option of such peoples. However, in addition to appearing in the game world long before they are historically attested and associated with a region and settlement rather to the south of their actual territory, it must be remembered the game starts in 273 BCE, and the Iceni are located in this game around Camalodunum, which is now modern Colchester, in Essex rather than East Anglia. The inclusion of them as a potential imperial power in this game's version of the ancient world is rather ironic, given the main reasons for their fame. The Iceni's claim to fame is primarily as resistors of imperialism, launching a rebellion under their queen Boudica in response to Roman oppression circa 60 AD, which, though initially successful, was ultimately crushed by the provincial governor. It should be noted that Britain, at this age of primarily rustic settlement organisation and very limited naval technology, was in no position to become an imperial power governing territories overseas, and tended to be dominated by outsiders, first by invaders and possible colonists from northern Gaul, and then of course by Rome. Having the Iceni lead the Iron Age Britons to form a continent-spanning empire rivaling or even subsuming Rome might present a kind of allo-historical irony, but ultimately requires a substantial departure from reality in order to be believable. Our second case study concerns the Swabi. As with the Iceni, historically speaking, the Swabi are known from a handful of Latin and Greek textual sources. They are first identified by Caesar in his commentaries on the Gallic Wars as a particularly powerful and aggressive group amongst the wild, barbarous Germanic peoples living beyond the Rhine. Later sources, notably Pliny the Elder and Tacitus in his book The Germania, portray the Swabi less as a unified political force and more of a loosely defined cultural grouping identified by shared religious and social customs amongst the various northern European peoples. Unlike the Iceni, the Swabi arguably have a reasonable claim to being representatives of the Iron Age Germanic peoples as a potential military power, in that they were described, by Caesar at least, as pursuing external conflicts. However, the Swabi, or really the Germani in general, are treated not as imperialists in ancient textual sources, but rather as a foil to Roman imperialism in their violent isolationism. Germanic tribes, we are told, went to war with their neighbours not in order to subjugate them, but only either to raid or even to expel them and create buffers of empty wasteland around their borders. This is probably a rhetorical exaggeration on the part of authors more interested in deploying the Germani as devices of exoticism and as a kind of mirror to the evolving Roman Empire, rather than offering a strictly factual testimony, but it does shape our understanding of an otherwise deeply enigmatic culture. As they appear in Total War Rome 2, the Swabi, although sharing goals of continental domination, are characterized by a greater emphasis on raiding enemy territory and sacking or razing enemy settlements than certain other playable cultures like Rome, gaining greater economic bonuses from doing so and being tasked with more chapter missions and objectives that involve doing so. Although this comes with a potential justification from the sources, I do feel obliged to criticise it somewhat as a scholar of ancient peoples often labelled barbarians, in pointing out that the Swabi, however violent they may have been, never to our knowledge committed atrocities on the scale of Rome's brutal destruction of cities including Carthage and Corinth. Our third and final case study of non-Roman peoples represented as playable options and potential empires in Total War Rome 2 focuses on Massilia, aka Masalia, aka Marseille. Massilia was a Greek colonial city-state founded on the southern coast of what is now France, ancient Gaul, by merchants from the city of Phocaea, according to legend at least, around 600 BCE. Available historical records, sadly none of which survive, written by Massaliots themselves, do point to the city having something of a military presence in the region. Over the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, it entered into the shifting web of conflicts and alliances between Carthage, Syracuse, and various Etruscan city-states manoeuvring for control of the trade routes of the western Mediterranean. It founded a number of fortified trading posts along the nearby coastline, including a settlement that would one day become the modern French city of Nice. It did also extract tribute, possible taxation, from certain territories and populations further inland, at least in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE. However, Massilia, as a predominantly mercantile society, isolated territorially from its cultural counterparts, is never known to have embarked on great campaigns of territorial expansion. Its chora, that is the agricultural landed territory around a Greek city-state, never really stretching more than a few miles inland from the coast. Instead, Massilia tended to act as a local ally for higher military powers, most notably entering into a long and fruitful partnership with Rome, which only really ended when the Massaliots ended up picking the wrong side in the Roman civil war of 50 to 46 BCE. The inclusion of Massilia in Total War Rome 2 as a potential imperial power thus appears to fit the mould of a rather removed brand of alternative history, allowing players the fantasy of building a Greek empire based in Western Europe and the chance to try out a faction with an interesting mixed roster of military units drawn from a combination of Greek and Gallic approaches to warfare, rather than representing a historically accurate potentiality of Massilia as a great empire. For the third part of this video essay, I would like to have a quick look at how the Total War games dealing with the Roman period address a lot of the ethical implications raised by imperialism. Empire building, by its nature, is an extremely violent business involving war, conquest, and is backed up by economic exploitation and the perpetuation of profound political, economic, and legal inequalities between people groups. Rome Total War is not a game that tends to delve very deeply into the moral considerations of forging an empire in the ancient world. While it does present a fair amount of historical and archaeological info and trivia on things like buildings, military units, and social organisations for those taking an interest, it does so in a rather neutral way. The main and arguably only point wherein the ethical landscape of conflict and imperialism appears lies in the handling of introducing the various powers through their intro cinematics. While each of the three playable Roman dynasties, the Julii, Scipii, and Brutii respectively, each get their own, all share a presentation of their subjects in a rather anti-heroic or even villainous light, making them violently ambitious, greedy, and openly bigoted. By contrast, Carthage and the so-called barbarian powers, Gaul, Britannia, and Germania in the main game, are presented substantially more sympathetically, castigating Roman aggression towards them and portraying their engagement in conflict as a defensive response rather than an expansionistic one. This arguably frames the alternate history approach of the game, and its much criticised inaccurate portrayal of certain non-Roman cultures, as a way for the player to imagine what it might have been like if they had successfully resisted Roman imperialism, playing from that perspective after having worked to subjugate them on their first outing. By contrast, Total War Rome 2 opens with a cinematic showcasing conflict from the perspective of various in-game cultures, though notably In addition to portraying war in a satisfyingly gamified, badass way, it looks at the destruction and suffering that results from it. The cinematic ends with the previously shown commander figures from each culture turning to break the fourth wall and looking to the player with concerned, questioning expressions, followed by the Latin tagline, Quo usque pro Roma Ibis? How far will you go for Rome? This frames the player's actions with regard to the game itself as more ethically ambiguous, even murky. But how far does this actually carry through into the experience of playing itself? On the one hand, certain aspects of the game echo this critical perspective. Notably, slave revolts, an in-game obstacle to the smooth running of the player's empire, are portrayed as heroic resistance on the part of the abused and exploited, and the player successfully crushing them is rendered bittersweet by its portrayal. Similarly, although given options to enslave or even massacre prisoners of war after a victory in battle, the option to release, or more accurately to ransom them, tends to be the most straightforward and beneficial, in my gaming experience at least. On the other hand, as noted particularly with powers such as the Swabi, the game can often encourage the sacking or razing of enemy cities as an objective, and when doing so there is relatively little moment of pause or consideration. A criticism may be that ultimately Total War Rome 2 wants to have its cake and eat it, offering the player a highly gamified, user-friendly simulation of ancient imperialism, while suggesting, rather than exploring, its deeper ethical ramifications. For the fourth and final part of this essay, I would like to quickly look at some of the issues arising from attempting to portray ancient imperialism in the form of a game, the inaccuracies that can arise from this, and attempts to address those issues through modding. That is, for the uninitiated, creating unofficial, modified versions of the game available for download. A good example of a realism mod is Europa Barbarorum, a mod for Rome Total War 1 whose name translates as Europe of the Barbarians. It aims primarily to overhaul the representation of the so-called barbarian peoples away from the Mediterranean world in a more accurate manner. One of its innovations on the main game was the implementation of specific versions and levels of administrative organisation, distinguishing capital cities, provincial governorates, colonial settlements, client states, etc., into the game's building tree, without which conquered territories could not construct other useful buildings or recruit troops. While fascinating and a much more true-to-history representation of the challenges and obstacles of managing a vast and complex empire in the ancient world, its implementation not only slows down the pace of the game substantially, but can make it frustratingly difficult to manage, especially in attempts to play as cultures with relatively humble starting positions. This helps to highlight the nature of Total War's gamified approach, adding a further component of Brechtian self-awareness to approaching history through this lens. To conclude, while Rome Total War and Total War Rome 2 are an interesting way of engaging with and potentially learning about the ancient world and the conflicts of empire therein, they do raise certain issues in their portrayal. Their gamification of historical events can lead to potentially weak historiography of how and why empires like that of Rome arose. In framing the period circa 275 BCE to 15 AD in the Mediterranean, Middle East and Europe as a world of conquer or be conquered, do the games suggest that the formation of empires, with all the violence and suffering they entailed, was an inevitability? Is the option to play and win the games as a culture that did not, in actuality, get involved in empire building a chance to turn the tables on the Romans and stand up for history's victims, or does it just double down on the idea that imperialism was, and possibly still is, unavoidable one way or another? I'll leave you to ponder and debate the matter.